In 1942, the federal government published a ratio: 1 pound of beef stretched across 12 servings. Households under real scarcity used that ratio to cut beef consumption 40% without the meal feeling thin. It wasn't a recipe. It was arithmetic, cost per plate, not cost per pound. That arithmetic no longer exists, and the reason it vanished has nothing to do with abundance. In May 1941, government officials, military doctors, and leading scientists gathered in Washington for the National Nutrition Conference for Defense. Their transcripts and memos reveal a stark alarm. Draft boards had rejected nearly 40% of potential recruits for medical reasons, and a striking portion of those failures traced back to underweight and malnutrition. The War Department's own reports described a pattern. Young men from both cities and rural towns arrived at induction centers too thin, too anemic, or too weak to serve. The Surgeon General's office warned that poor diets at home were now a matter of national defense, not just private misfortune. The conference did not treat nutrition as a private lifestyle choice. It declared food a weapon of readiness and morale. Delegates heard that in 1936, more than a third of American families bought food that could not rate better than poor in dietary surveys. By 1941, that reality had become a liability for the war effort. President Roosevelt's opening remarks called for a total nutrition mobilization, urging every household to see the dinner table as part of the national arsenal. The message was blunt: a nation that could not feed its children well enough to build strong soldiers would struggle to win a global conflict. This new federal logic filtered down to every kitchen. Ration limits and price controls forced families to rethink what a pound of beef actually meant. The old butcher's math, how many plates, how much broth, how many leftovers, became a civic duty. Nutrition experts and home economists, backed by the authority of the conference, began teaching that the real measure of meat was not the weight in a package, but the number of complete, satisfying meals it could help create. Scarcity, not abundance, shaped the arithmetic. In this climate, the stretch ratio was not a clever trick, but a necessity, one that made every ounce of beef work for the entire table. A modern grocery trip begins in a sea of shrink-wrap trays, each one shouting its weight in bold numbers. The labels promise value, family packs, bonus ounces, price per pound, but none of it says what really matters: how much dinner you are actually buying. Most shoppers reach for the biggest tray that fits the budget, trusting that more ounces mean more meals. But the package hides the real math. Under the plastic, there is bone, fat, and water weight. The price tag does not mention what is trimmed away or how much ends up as leftovers, stock, or waste. Retail studies show that today's meat counter is designed for speed and simplicity, not for yield. Since the 1970s, the industry has trained consumers to see meat as a single-use product: one tray, one meal, one main event. Family pack marketing pushes bigger portions, but the real cost per plate is buried under packaging and portion confusion. A 2022 report from the Institute for Food Marketing found that family-size beef trays have grown by more than a third in net weight over the last decade, while the price per pound has dropped. The catch is this: the actual number of plates per package has not kept pace because most buyers do not know how to factor in trimming loss or stretching options. The center of the plate mindset locks shoppers into a cycle of overbuying and underusing. The sticker price becomes the only number that matters, while the knowledge of how to turn a pound of beef into multiple, satisfying meals slips away. The result is a quiet information gap, one that the old butcher's ledger made visible and that modern packaging works hard to conceal. The promise of abundance is just an illusion of bulk. What is missing is the math that once made every ounce count. At the heart of the neighborhood butcher's shop stood a battered ledger, its columns filled with numbers that meant more than just inventory. They tracked how every cut of beef could be stretched across meals. The butcher's day began with a calculation: the live weight of a side, the expected loss to bone and fat, and the real yield after trimming. Trade manuals taught that a bone-in chuck might yield 60% usable meat, while a rib roast could drop to 55%. These weren't just figures for pricing, they were the foundation for how many plates a family could expect from a purchase. The counter itself became a classroom. Butchers would pencil out the cost per plate for a customer, factoring in not just the main cut, but the broth from bones, the fat saved for gravy, and the leftovers destined for tomorrow's stew. A typical entry might read, 1 4-pound roast, trimmed and cooked, yields 2.5 pounds of edible meat, enough for 8 plates if paired with potatoes and gravy. The trimmings didn't go in the bin, they were wrapped in brown paper, handed over with a reminder to simmer them for broth. This ritual turned scraps into structure, flavor, and a second meal, all tracked in the ledger. Oral histories recall the stern, practical advice given over the counter. Save the bones for soup, use the drippings for your potatoes, and stretch the roast with carrots and barley. The ledger wasn't just a record, it was a tool for survival, teaching families to think in terms of yield and satisfaction rather than raw weight. In this system, the butcher became a keeper of knowledge, guiding households to make every ounce of beef count, not by magic, but by careful, practiced arithmetic. The math behind the wartime beef stretch was not a clever trick or a marketing slogan. It was a step-by-step system, engineered and printed on cards, bulletins, and worksheets by the USDA and extension specialists. The centerpiece was the 1-to-3 ratio, 1 pound of beef combined with 3 pounds of extenders such as potatoes, noodles, barley, or fortified cereal. This was not guesswork. The 1942 circulars from the USDA spelled it out. 1 pound of beef, 3 pounds of filler, 12 servings. Each plate held about 2 ounces of meat, just enough to flavor the meal and deliver the necessary protein. A typical stretch ratio card from a county extension office listed the calculation in plain numbers. 1 pound of ground beef, 3 cups of cooked noodles, a can of tomato soup, dinner for 6, with roughly 40% less beef per plate than a traditional steak meal. The cost math was just as blunt. In wartime worksheets, the price per serving dropped from 42 cents for a meat-centered dinner to 15 cents when the stretch system was used. The difference was measured not in what was saved at the register, but in how many plates the same pound could fill. Flora Rose, a Cornell home economist, promoted fortified blends like Milcorno, a mixture of dried milk and cornmeal designed to carry beef's protein further. These blends, along with white sauce and systematic broth making, turned beef into a base for gravy, stock, and planned leftovers. The goal was never luxury. It was honest fullness, engineered out of scarcity. The ledger logic was clear. Meat became structure, flavor, and second meal value. The question was always, how far can this pound go? Not just tonight, but for tomorrow's soup or casserole. The practical outcome was a 40% cut in beef use, achieved not by sacrifice, but by a toolkit of ratios, extenders, and planned reuse, all tracked by the plate, not the package. The arrival of boxed beef in the late 1960s rewrote the rules of the meat counter. Refrigerated trucks and vacuum-sealed subprimals replaced the butcher's block with a central processing line. Knife work moved from the neighborhood shop to giant packing plants, and the math that once lived in the ledger vanished behind shrink wrap. Today, 4 companies, Tyson Foods, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef, control over 80% of U.S. beef processing. In 1977, the top 4 packers held just 25% of the market. By 2022, that figure had tripled. The shift was not just about efficiency. It meant that most shoppers saw only a uniform tray and a shelf price, not the yield, trim, or bone that the old counter made visible. Standardized cuts and national pricing replaced local advice, and the cost per plate logic that once stretched every ounce faded from view. The ledger was replaced by a barcode, and the knowledge gap widened with every mile between the plant and the plate. A modern stretch formula starts at the butcher's counter, or wherever you buy your meat, by choosing a small, trimmed cut instead of a family pack. Start with a pound of beef, not as the centerpiece, but as the foundation. Brown the meat, then simmer it with water and aromatics to create a concentrated stock. This step takes about 45 minutes and transforms every ounce into flavor for the whole meal. Next, add 3 parts extender, such as potatoes, barley, noodles, or beans. The classic wartime ratio is 1 pound of beef to 3 pounds of extender. Stir in the stock and finish with a white sauce or gravy to bind everything together. The result is a dozen plates, each with about 2 ounces of beef, but enough substance and taste to satisfy. Track your total cost and servings in a notebook or use an online cost per plate calculator. The math is simple and the savings are real. Today, most shoppers see a bar code, not a ledger. But when meat is flavor, structure, and second meal value, not just ounces, the real question shifts. How many plates did you make? The package is not the deal. The ledger is the deal. Thanks for watching. Join the conversation below.